So this week I'll be reviewing Darkest Dungeon, which is a punishing turn-based gothic RPG roguelite. It's a lot of fun to play, and has some very rich gameplay that really rewards knowledge and planning. But the game also has the perfect storm of frustrating mechanics at times, and kind of borders on not being a roguelite. So let's get into it. Also, it's a really long review, so I'll have an outline of all my sections and topics in the description below, so feel free to skip around as you please. In Darkest Dungeon, you set off from an upgradable home base with 4 heroes, and you go on runs into various areas and dungeons. The goal of the game is to upgrade your town and heroes in order to clear the most difficult dungeon, as well as the bosses in each of the areas. It's fairly easy to pick up, understand the basics, but there's a lot of depth to the mechanics present that you can learn more about in order to get even better at the game. The combat itself is a good take on classic turn-based combat. You have 4 hero spots, and each skill from each hero can only be used in certain spots, and you can only attack certain enemy spots. The base game has some good variety of classes with 15 classes to choose from, and 2 more locked behind paid DLC, which we'll talk a little about later. I think the game does a really good job of making the classes all feel distinct from each other, which is impressive given how many different classes there are. I think it helps that there are so many different mechanics in the game, so different classes can focus on different mechanics such as bleeding or debuffing or healing or whatever. Within each class, there's also a couple different skills you can choose, so you can customize within each class as well. Some classes are definitely more important or just strictly better than others, such as the Vestal, which is probably the most important class in the game because it's the best healing class. But there's also a lot of personal taste and flavor preference as well. And the same class might be useless in some areas and very helpful or necessary for other types of runs or bosses. And trying out all these different classes is one of the fun elements of the game. Within the combat itself, all attacks have a damage range, a crit chance, a miss chance, a % chance condition if applicable, and because of that there's a lot of randomness with what exactly will happen with each given attack, with each given skill. And I'll expand on this more in the RNG section. This can contribute to the hopeless feeling that they're kind of going for, or potentially some clutch saves, but it can also lead to some incredibly frustrating moments where you miss attacks repeatedly, again and again as you're fighting some boss or something like that. Overall, the game is meant to be punishing and frustrating. You'll spend a lot of time upgrading a hero, and probably eventually you'll have them die at some point in order to defeat some boss or finish a mission, or just because of pure bad luck. Because there is permadeath in the game, you'll lose that character forever. Losing characters is part of the game and something you kind of have to accept if you want to progress, though obviously you can play less risky and you can usually leave runs prematurely to save characters if you want to. It can be a bit annoying to have to re-level up characters as some of them die, but as you play more, it's easier to get new heroes, it's easier to level up the ones that you have. That said, this leveling up of characters, this leveling up of heroes, is some grind that's present in the game. There are some options to manage the difficulty of the games when you start the game, when you start a given campaign. The first settings are basically the same when the fights themselves, but the easier one, called Radiant, makes some changes that reduce the grind of leveling up these heroes again, reduce the grind of upgrading your town to make things a little quicker. As a whole, I'd really describe Darkest Dungeon as a game of attrition, endurance, and resource management, both within each given run and between them. Within each run, you have to manage both an HP and a stress bar as the game goes on. Getting too stressed can result in character penalties, or occasionally buffs, and getting even more stress can cause your character to have a heart attack and die. While you heal your health between each run, you have to manage the stress with hamlet buildings, which adds another resource to manage, so to speak. This basically forces you to try new characters, which I think is actually a good mechanic because there's a lot of fun classes to try out, but it also adds an element of grind and delays in building up a full roster of heroes that you can use on the harder, more difficult runs. There are a lot of other small things to micromanage as well, such as each hero's quirks and stuff like that. I think these choices and management are generally good and add some depth to the game. They can also be a little annoying to have to micromanage all these things, and it's really more micromanagement than you would expect from a typical roguelite, which I'll talk about more in the progression section. You can also ignore a lot of this micromanagement and be mostly fine, at least for the start of each campaign. As I've mentioned, this game has the classic home base or hamlet that you upgrade between missions. This part of the game is arguably more important than the actual runs themselves. It's the main area of sort of cross progression, in addition to obviously your characters themselves carrying over, provided they don't die on a particular given run. You don't need to fully upgrade every building in the hamlet to beat the game, but certain buildings and upgrades are basically essentials, such as the blacksmith giving upgrades to give you better armor and better weapons for your heroes. There are 5 different areas in the base game, with the DLC adding 2 more. Each area has their own enemy type and feel to it. I think they did a good job at making each area feel unique with the enemy types and environments, and each of these areas also have multiple bosses with different difficulties, and they all feel pretty different from each other in a good way. And Darkest Dungeon is really a game where knowledge helps you out a ton. So for example, for each of these areas, if you know what kind of enemies you're going to face, that will change your team composition. So for example, you should not run a bunch of bleeding builds in the ruins because you're going to fight a bunch of skeletons who have very high bleeding resist. So knowledge and learning from your mistakes is really essential for beating certain bosses and for just getting through the game in general. For example, you might need to bring some debuffing hero for one boss. You might need to bring some characters that have heavy one target damage for another boss. These are all examples just to say that there's a lot of depth to the gameplay, and it's one of the areas that Darkest Dungeon shines brightest, so to speak, as a game, having this depth of gameplay. If I were to change how I played the game, I would have done a lot more research earlier on in my time in Darkest Dungeon, scouring the wiki, reading Reddit, those kind of things, which I think is really a testament again to how rich that gameplay is. I don't think you need to do all these things to have fun with the game, but there is a lot of depth there for those that want to explore it. Also, when you get to some of the hardest bosses in sort of the final dungeon, you will either need to do some research or be willing to fail a lot while learning, or you'll have to do both in order to actually clear some of those. So overall, I would say the gameplay is really fun and rich in Darkest Dungeon, but there's a lot more resource management, there's a lot more grind than I would have expected. Darkest Dungeon has a lot of RNG and randomness baked into it, but not in the same way that other roguelites do. And this is one of my biggest frustrations with the game. Typical roguelites have RNG with what enemies you face, what stuff you encounter on your runs, what upgrades you find, etc. These aren't really as important in Darkest Dungeon. When you choose a region to do a run in, you can see the general length of the run, you'll know what enemies you will encounter in the region, done your research if you played that before and paid attention, and you will know what kind of rewards the run will give you. There's a small amount of variety in dungeon structure, but it really more breaks monotony than provides any meaningful difference in gameplay between runs. There's a similar style RNG randomness in which heroes you can recruit each week, in which quests are available in a given week, but over time you can get all the heroes and do all the quests and all the rewards and stuff. So that's sort of more flavorful, good RNG without really impacting gameplay that much. Where the RNG is different from a lot of other roguelites is the RNG in the combat itself. There are a ton of mechanics in fights that rely on chance. There's a % chance of accuracy for each attack, there's a % chance of dodging, crits, damage ranges, there's a % chance of bleeding or other conditions on attack, and there's a % chance of resisting all of those conditions for a given enemy or hero. So all this randomness means that you don't know exactly what will happen each given turn. You don't know how it will turn out. You'll eventually have a moment where you miss 5 attacks in a row, even with a 95% chance of hitting. You also have moments where enemies get big crits and maybe knock out a hero, even if they're at full health. These can obviously be insanely frustrating, especially when you consider the randomness in combination to the extremely punishing nature of the game. This randomness can cause you to not kill a boss before they heal up, or it can cause you to lose a character, which leads to the inevitable grind of having to level up another hero. In fact, I found this quality so frustrating that it made me take 2 different month or so long breaks from the game. I definitely would have taken at least one more if I didn't want to finish the game for this review. Of course, the RNG can also work in your favor, with some clutch dodges and stuff. You do have some control over it. You can boost your dodge chance with certain skills, you have trinkets that increase your accuracy or crit chance, you can debuff enemies that have high dodge if you bring the right heroes. So that's again where that knowledge can be very useful, but the game never lets you have full control over what's going to happen. And this can be extremely frustrating if it causes you to lose a hero. You have to spend an hour or 2 leveling one up again, or something like that. So overall, I'd say RNG is critical, sometimes insanely frustrating in Darkest Dungeon, but the RNG takes a different form than it does in a lot of other roguelites. Now let's talk about the progression in Darkest Dungeon, and why I don't think that it should be considered a roguelite. So Darkest Dungeon is immediately different from other roguelites in that you start a campaign instead of a run. All of your progress is contained in a particular campaign, and you beat the game by clearing the hardest dungeon quests in a particular campaign, which usually takes around 50 to 80 hours, depending on your difficulty setting and your skill in beating the game. Within each campaign, you do dungeon runs, which take about 5 to 10 minutes for shorter ones, to up to an hour for some of the longer ones. Between each of these, you level up and manage your heroes and your town, which is where a lot of the progression comes in. It's a very resource management heavy game, as I mentioned before. It actually adds a lot of grind to the game. You need to do a lot of runs in order to upgrade your hamlet and your buildings. Also, whenever a hero dies, as I said before, you need to level a new one up, which can add a lot of grind and stuff to do. So throughout all of this, you have a lot of standard roguelite elements. For example, you have permadeath and you have some procedurally generated levels. But Darkest Dungeon is much more like a standard non-roguelite game campaign. In a standard roguelite, you start up a run and it's self-contained. You can clear the game in a particular run and you could clear it again in the next run. But in Darkest Dungeon, progress isn't marked by these runs at all. It's marked by clearing different bosses or quests on distinct runs, as opposed to being able to clear the game from start to finish in one particular run. In short, there's so much progression required in Darkest Dungeon with upgrading the hamlet, and the goals of the game are to beat the bosses and the quests in a particular campaign. You have to grind a lot in order to beat these bosses, to upgrade the hamlet, and all those kind of things. It just doesn't feel like a roguelite where you can boot it up and get a distinct self-contained run where you play the game from start to finish. I've also never played a roguelite that required so much grind in it. Of course, it's still a fun game overall, and there's a lot of things that are positive about it, but it doesn't really feel like a roguelite. It doesn't scratch that roguelite itch in the same way. In terms of narrative or story, this game does much better than a lot of other roguelites. The game has a constant narrator, who is your ancestor, who provides the story for the game, as well as numerous one-liners throughout the game.
Inspiration and improvement. Exposed to a killing blow.
These one-liners add a lot of character to the game, and they're some of the more iconic sayings from the game, but if you play the game for like 6 hours in a row, they can get a little bit of annoying and lose their charm. Also, aside, the narrator is a horrible person. But anyways, the game has a lot of cutscenes and journal articles and pages to collect that have the lore of the game, and there's some short monologues before each boss where the narrator explains the boss's origin. The lore doesn't go so far as like explain the source of many of these monsters that you encounter on a deep level, so much as the narrator did X bad, evil, corrupt, etc. thing, and it led to Y boss that you happen to be fighting right now. So it's more of a short backstory for why each monster is there, as opposed to rich world building or lore. Still, if you're looking for a roguelite with some lore, story, or narrative, it's one of the best examples out there, along with Hades and Griftlands, which actually I did a review of recently that you can check out. Now let's talk about the DLC in Darkest Dungeon. There are 3 paid gameplay DLCs in Darkest Dungeon, and I'll run through all of them in this section fairly quickly so that you can get a quick feel for them. We also have a free PvP DLC coming out soon, which I'm really excited for, but obviously it's not out yet, so I'm not going to review it here. Something else to keep in mind with all of these DLCs is that you can enable them after starting the campaign. So you can buy the game, play the base game, and see how you like it before you choose to buy this DLC and see if you want to add it to your campaign. And you can add it to your campaign 20 hours in, you don't have to restart. So the first DLC release was Crimson Court, which adds a new area to attack and new enemies for that area. The runs themselves are both shorter standard runs and epic length campaigns. It's where you have to exit and re-enter the mission in order to beat it because the maps are so massive. Also, side note, if you do play through this DLC, these epic maps are not randomized, so you can save yourself a lot of time if you look up where things are, as opposed to just wandering around aimlessly, where I wasted a lot of time doing. But anyways, the bosses and the new enemies are pretty cool. These epic sort of boss missions can also feel a little tedious at times because the maps are so large. This DLC also adds some of the strongest trinkets in the game, as well as trinket sets, which give a bonus if you have both of the Crimson Court trinkets for a given class. It also adds the Flagellant class, which is one of my favorite in the game. It focuses on bleeding, some healing, and some special skills when you have low health. The DLC also gives you kind of warning when you try to activate it that it's not for new players. I think that's totally fair. I activated it about halfway through my campaign, and I'm glad that I did not have it the whole time. So the Crimson Court area and events kind of bleed into all the other areas. These Sectoid, which are the unique enemies to the Crimson Court DLC, bleed over and will enter these other areas, and they make the normal content just more difficult. These DLC specific enemies can also have this debuff that they'll add to your heroes that lasts across different fights, and you have to manage that as well. And the only way to get rid of this debuff is to sort of progress through the quests in the Crimson Court DLC, which will require you to have stronger heroes, be further along in the campaign, and sort of know what you're doing. These DLC specific enemies are also harder by some of the RNG mechanics, such as increased dodge, for example. So if you've been frustrated, like I have been occasionally, by some of these mechanics, you'll probably be even more frustrated by the Crimson Court enemies and encounters. That said, I think if you really like Darkest Dungeon, you should definitely get this DLC. But if you find the grind, the resource management, the randomness of Darkest Dungeon, and knowing are frustrating, you probably will not like this DLC either, because it adds on to more of those things. The second DLC adds the Shieldbreaker class. This class is also one of my favorite classes in the game, and it focuses on damage, blocking, and blight focused builds. The DLC also adds a few new enemies and some lore for this new class that you can uncover as you play through the game with that class. Overall, I'd say it's a great addition to the game, but it's not that much content, so you might want to be more price sensitive with what you're paying for this. But if you like Dark Dungeon, it's definitely a DLC that you should pick up because again, the class is really fun. It's one of my favorite in the game. Finally, there is Color Madness DLC, which adds a new Endless mode for you to play through. The DLC is mostly self-contained to this new area with the Endless mode. You can even get special max level heroes from the recruiting area for this Endless mode so that you don't kill your heroes that actually take time to level up. The Endless mode itself is pretty fun, and it feels a lot more similar to a standard roguelite experience in the rest of the game. The DLC also adds new trinkets and buildings for you to unlock as you play through it. Similar to Crimson Court, there is one boss from this DLC that sometimes roams the other areas, but does not feel anywhere near as intrusive as Crimson Court. And again, the DLC is mostly self-contained to this new area. Overall, I think I like this DLC the most, and the Endless mode really scratched that roguelite itch that I wanted it to. Of course, it still requires the same stress management, the same quirk management, the same trinket management as the base game, as normal Darkest Dungeon, but it's a great addition if you like the core Darkest Dungeon gameplay, you want that sort of more roguelite style gameplay, but with marginally less grind. So now for my overview, summary, and verdict for Darkest Dungeon. It's a really great game overall, and it has a large amount of depth to that gameplay. If you want a game where you'll be rewarded for having knowledge, this is a great game for that. There is a lot of resource and hero micromanagement required, which can be fun if you're into that, and can be annoying if you're not. That said, you can avoid most of the micromanagement and still have fun with the game. Darkest Dungeon's biggest flaw, in my opinion, are its grind that's required, and its sometimes infuriating mix of random chance and extremely punishing mechanics. It fails that punishing but fair mantra of Souls-type games, and more is along the line of punishing and sometimes fair, sometimes not. Also, not a flaw per se, but it doesn't really feel similar to a lot of other roguelites when you play through it, because you're playing through a campaign and completing a serious quest as opposed to doing discrete roguelite runs. If you're into the base game, the DLC can add a lot. They don't feel necessary to the experience, in my opinion. You can also start playing through the base game and decide if you want the DLC later on. If you want a long, turn-based RPG with some roguelite elements, definitely check this game out. Just be aware that it can be frustrating and grindy at times. It's one of the most iconic games out there in the broader roguelite genre, so it's definitely worth checking out on sale for at least the base game itself. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video or you found it informative, please like this video to help me out. And you can check out more of my reviews in my playlist with a link in the description below. So yeah, thanks for watching.